Just go ahead.
Yeah, I can just do a quick introduction. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure today. We're gonna have Cynthia Barber, PhD. She is like a senior director of programming manager in Vertex, and she's gonna talk about her career, her journey. Please make questions, interact. Cynthia, thank you very much for accepting be with us here, even that through Zoom. And is yours.
Great, thanks. No, I'm happy to be here. I remember my academic career quite clearly and how useful it can be to hear about, what lies beyond the postdoctoral experience. So I do have a few slides here. Can you see my screen? You see the slides?
Yes.
Excellent. A few slides to just tell you a little bit about my career and kind of frame up where I'm coming from, and then open up to questions. So I couldn't come up with just one title about my life, so I put 3 of them on there, but we can go with that last one. There is life after academia. So move forward. And this is kind of a favored format for our career journey presentations at work, but we'll go down the timeline. I was actually born and raised in Anchorage, Alaska, which is not exactly the cradle of the biotech industry. So I've had quite a journey from there. I headed out to Colorado for my undergraduate degree, and I was at Boulder. I triple majored in molecular cellular developmental biology, math, and biochemistry. Then I decided to head further east for my graduate work, and I headed out to MIT here in Massachusetts, where I still live. And during my PhD, I was in Troy Littleton's lab, and I was doing neurobiology research with Drosophila. So up here, I kind of represent those years and the different techniques I spent a lot of time doing. So lots of Western blots, some microscopy looking here at the neuromuscular junction in the dissected larvae, and then electrophysiology. Out of all of these, I decided I liked looking at the images more than anything else. And so for my postdoctoral work, I headed to Brandeis University. This is still in Massachusetts. I was a Leukemia and Lymphoma Society postdoctoral fellow, and I did electron microscopy work. And I was focusing on electron tomography, looking at frozen samples. So this is extremely low dose electron microscopy work. Requires averaging many pieces. So we're looking here, I worked on Chlamydomonas, and they have these flagella with these repeating units, microtubule based units that they use for locomotion. And so this represented a really great system for us to average get a lot of images in one sample and be able to average it out to look at the structure of these motors. And it was a fascinating system, and I learned a lot. And if you wanted, like I said, I wanted to look at more images, and I looked at more images during my postdoctoral work. Now, during my whole academic career, I was really focused on becoming a faculty member. That was very much my intention. And when I got to the end of my postdoctoral work, I did launch a faculty search, but the market is tough, and I'm sure it's still tough now. And I knew that the chances of finding exactly the situation that I'd be happy with were not, it wasn't guaranteed. So in parallel to my my search for an academic position, I also started thinking about what I could do in industry. Now, while I loved looking at images and I loved thinking about science, I did not really like pipetting. And I was always in science for the thought aspect of it and not the kind of hands-on bench work. And so when I decided to start my job search on the industry side, I knew that I wanted to get away from the bench. I had a friend who was a medical writer. She was one of my friends from graduate school. And she kept pushing me, you should think about medical writing. You should think about medical writing, which is something I didn't know a lot about, but I knew I liked writing. So I started looking for that. Now, the hard part when you're making this transition out of academics and into industry is really demonstrating, and especially if you're stepping away from the bench, I should say, is demonstrating that you're truly interested and committed to making that switch. It's important even if you're still looking at bench work. People on the industry side will always look at a candidate and question, do they really understand what this transition is going to mean to them and the style of working, and are they really ready for it? But it's twice that if you're leaving the bench. So with keeping in mind that I wanted to become a medical writer, or those were the jobs I was applying for, I started looking for opportunities to demonstrate my writing, my interest in writing. And so I found this website, Bite Size Bio, which people can write articles on, technical topics, and it gets posted. I don't know if anyone's ever looked at the website, but I started doing that so I could point to, hey, I've published some articles. And of course, I actually did get paid for it, not a lot, but it was a paying gig that demonstrated my interest in the field. And then I also joined the American Medical Writers Association. And so this is a professional association for medical writers, but they have a lot of training available. And so I could start to do those trainings and demonstrate that I really did have a knowledge of this field I was looking to move into. So even if you're not looking to become a writer, there are professional societies out there for almost every aspect of industry and biotech. And so joining those can be a way to both inform yourself about the transition you're looking to make, and then also demonstrate that knowledge and commitment to the places you're applying to. So I ended up landing a job at Vertex Pharmaceuticals, which is where I still am today. Vertex is a mid-sized pharmaceutical company headquartered in Boston. When I joined Vertex, it was focused on HCV. We had a blockbuster drug in HCV. And then we had just received approval for our first cystic fibrosis drug. And cystic fibrosis is a rare genetic disorder that affects the lungs. It affects the entire system, but most notably affects the lungs, and historically it led to early death. So we actually got beat out in the HCV field and became a cystic fibrosis company, where we've had a lot of success with a number of drugs that really changed the patient experience in that disease. So I joined Vertex as a regulatory medical writer. Now, I told you I was looking for medical writing jobs. To be honest, I didn't even know the difference between the different kinds of medical writing jobs there are out there. There are many in the industry. I became a regulatory medical writer, which means I was writing all the documents that we send to the FDA and other regulators related to our clinical studies. So in this role, I had great experience to everything about how drug development works. And I partnered with physicians to help design the protocols, wrote them up, was involved as the studies were running, and then helped interpret the data at the end of the study. One of the big shocks to me in moving to industry from academics is that in academics, you're always working these very small teams. You may have a couple of collaborators at most. Sometimes you're almost, working on your own. But in industry, we have big teams for everything. To run a single clinical study, we have a study execution team within the company that has maybe 20 to 30 people on it from different functions. And so it is a very collaborative experience, very different from what I experienced in academics, but something that I found very satisfying. I did that for about 4 years. I worked on a number of different disease areas at Vertex, one of which is our pain program, which is something I've now worked on in a number of different capacities through the years. After about 4 years as a medical writer, our company created a department for clinical scientists, which is an interesting role in industry. I like to think of the clinical scientist as the PhD that partners with the MD to design a clinical study. Not every clinical scientist has a PhD, but that's kind of the concept behind it. You know, many people with a medical degree haven't necessarily been exposed that much to experimental design in the way that PhDs are exposed to it. And so it's very beneficial to have someone there with that experience and really thinking through, how are we collecting data? Will it answer the questions I have? And will I be, and what will I have at the end of all of this? As a clinical scientist, I spent a lot of time doing literature research to think about what endpoints had been used in different disease areas in the past. How did they work for the drugs that are on the market? Do they seem like reliable endpoints where you get clean data? And then how could we apply it to our program? And what would it mean for the study design? So for some endpoints, you have to have a much longer study, for instance, to have any hope of changing the outcome. Also, as a clinical scientist, I was involved very deeply in monitoring the safety of patients on studies. So we, in a blinded fashion, are always looking at any adverse events that patients have experienced and interpreting, and looking to see, do we think it's still safe to continue running the study? Because we always want to put the patient's safety foremost in our minds. As a clinical scientist, I also was kind of moving up the ranks in the program. And I was a project leader for our pain program for a couple of years. And so I had a lot of responsibility in coordinating among the functions, how we were pulling together the program for some of the assets that we were moving through clinical development. Which led to my most recent change. So a little over a year ago, I actually moved from the clinical scientist group into program and portfolio management. And so in this role now, I really do specialize in the coordination of all the different functions. I actually oversee all the assets that are within our pain portfolio, and we have many in different stages of development, and really help bring the narrative to our executive committee about what we're trying to do with this program, how we plan to move forward, how do we plan to make decisions. And I was just telling my husband the other day, I think most of my job is really about helping us make decisions the right way. And that's where I am so far in my career. So I've already touched, a number of different functional areas. In companies and industry, there are, I've seen many successful people who move throughout different functions and departments and continue to just broaden their understanding. It's a very nice way to set up your career if you're looking to work at these more, where you're looking across more assets, more of the big company decisions of how we prioritize and move things forward. So with that, I can open for questions. Certainly any question, but I called out a few here. If you have any questions about careers in industry, leaving the bench, or how you navigate your career once you get into industry, happy to answer any of those.
I have some questions, but let's see if the audience, they have some questions first.
Hey, I have a question. Hey, Cynthia, thanks for coming through and giving us some insight. You mentioned that one of the biggest changes from going, that there are big changes from going from academia to industry, and that one of the questions that they ask, are you actually ready? What does that actually entail? Go ahead.
Absolutely. So I'll start with thinking about it from the bench, if you're moving from academics into a bench position in industry. So on the face of it, it might seem like it's not that big a change because you're still going to be pipetting or doing your PCRs and whatnot. So the thing that people in industry, are always concerned that folks coming over from academics may not be ready for is that you're no longer really in the driver's seat of your project and whether it's going to proceed. So the company is making a lot of decisions about where to put their money and resource, and ultimately you have to abide by their decisions. It doesn't mean you don't get to advocate for your project if you think it's very promising. It doesn't mean that there can't be room for exploration and side projects, but ultimately you have to, follow the company's priorities. And so that's like the biggest thing right there, is that people worry someone coming in from academics won't be ready to kind of let go of that level of control about what they're working on. Then I think the other thing is also this level of collaboration that I already spoke about. I spoke about it primarily in kind of the clinical development realm, but it also exists in the research realm in industry. Now, if you're at a very small company, you may still be doing like many different things and not collaborating with as many people, like if it's a very early startup. But if you're going to kind of a mid-sized biotech company, you're going to have a lot of collaboration and people in different research functions. So then, so that's all about kind of the bench side of it. If you're moving into clinical development, I think it's those same themes, but maybe a little different flavor, like recognizing that you're going to have to collaborate a lot more intensely, and that you will be kind of assigned to a seat, if you will, at the table. You'll have a certain role and be expected to do that. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, they're always concerned if somebody's really ready to stop doing bench work and switch to this other style and type of working.
Thank you, Cynthia. More questions?
Hello, I have one question.
Yep.
Thank you so much for giving us this talk, and it's really helpful. So my question is, for the position like clinical scientist, you said the person doesn't have to have a PhD. So I am a master's student and soon I'll be graduating. So do you think for me, if I like doing science and I want to go into industry, getting PhD is important?
Yeah. So I would say it depends on whether you want to leave bench work or not. So I'm guessing from the way you set up the question, you're thinking maybe of not doing bench work, but I'll answer for both. If you are planning to do bench work in industry, in many companies, I won't say in all companies, but it's very common that your kind of career progression is capped if you only have a master's degree. Like those top leadership positions in the research organization are generally reserved for PhDs. And so if somebody wants to do bench work in industry, I would encourage them to get a PhD for that reason. If they have aspirations to leading a group or leading a research program. If you're looking to leave the bench, I think it's a different story. Personally, my personal opinion is that getting a PhD is a lot of work emotionally and time. And, I'm not sure it's worth doing that unless you really want a job you can only do with a PhD. Like you want to be a professor or you want to be in a leadership position, in a research organization in industry. Now, does having a PhD make it easier to get a role in a job in industry? Yeah, I think it does. And it depends on exactly what market, like geographically, what market you're in, like particularly in Boston, where I am, there are many universities, and so there are many PhD students around, and so it can be, harder if you don't have the PhD. They're different, in different parts of the country. I think the market, it varies. But that said, like, it may be a little harder to get the job. It's not going to be 4 years harder to get a job, right? So PhD is a big time commitment. That's how I think of it. Overall, if you're transitioning into industry and trying to leave the bench, it will be hard, no matter like PhD, master's degree, bachelor's, whatever, it's hard to get the first job. But then once you have it, you're in, and that's just something you have to get through. So in general, if somebody knows they want to go to industry, I do encourage them to be kind of flexible about what type of role they're looking for, because it's almost most important you just get in the door, and then there's generally a lot of opportunity to explore and move to different functions and find what really is, exciting for you.
Sure, thank you. I have another question, but I'll let others answer. And if in the end we have time, I'll ask one more question.
I think there's one in the chat here. Oh, no. Yeah. How difficult is it to switch to industry after 5+ years of staying in academia post-PhD? I don't think the number of years, I don't think that is a big barrier. Maybe if it's 20 years, 15, 20 years, people might start to, it would just enhance that question. Are you ready to make the switch, right? The longer you've been in academics, the more people are going to think you may have become a creature of habit and not, be ready to change.
Necessarily catch at day 20 why there's some, because maybe on
Other questions?
I don't think so. Someone was, I think, with
I
Mike.
just want, oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, I just have one question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it.
So, yeah, in my, personal experience, like, as you said, like you mentioned, the important part is, I'm pretty sure I want to go for industry, but it has been kind of like difficult to me, like to make the jump.
Mm-hmm.
So anytime I have an interview, they always, how would you address that point? Like, you want to just go to industry, no matter what you have to do, what role would you have there? But they always like, you always have to apply for a specific role, and they want you to have like a lot of experience in that specific role. So yeah, do you have any advice, like how to jump to industry, like without because it's kind of difficult, because they always ask you, like, you have very specific skills, but you just want to just want to get a job in industry, no matter what is the role, just to start,
Yeah.
So do you have any advice in that sense? I don't know if I'm being clear.
Yeah. No, I get you. So I think a couple of points come to mind there. So while I think first thing comes to mind, I just encourage people to find a role to start with, right? You should always present to them a narrative about why you're really interested in that role. So even though I looked for many different types of medical writing jobs, I mentioned there's different types. There are people who write publications. There are people who do these documents that get sent to the FDA. There are people who write materials that are patient-facing. I always give like a story of why I'm interested in this particular job. And so they don't need to know I went to some other company, applied for some other job, right? Because I did have interest in the other job at the other company. And so I have a perfectly good narrative for them about why I'm interested in that job. But, I think it's important for people to always feel like you have real authentic interest in this particular role. Because if they feel, and this is something, if people feel like you're just desperate to get out of academics, that also can turn them off. So you have to just make sure you provide this clear story to them. So that was one thing. Another thing is that you mentioned the jobs often have a list of very specific requirements for what they're looking for. And, you know, I clearly remember when I did my job search, everyone wanted 5 years experience, 5 years experience as a medical writer, which I did not have, right? But, and then there, it just becomes almost a game of like finding the company who's not finding the candidate they're looking for, right? Everyone wants someone with 5 years experience, but that's not who everybody hires necessarily. And so if you can come again with a clear kind of narrative and demonstration of your interest, you know, you have to kind of just keep looking until you find the place that, you know, needs to broaden the definition of candidate they're looking for. And they've reached a point where they're like, okay, we do need to train someone else. So the role I applied to at Vertex, I did, you know, it was a role that said 5 years experience or 5+ years experience. But I applied to it nonetheless. I did network into somebody in the group. I had a friend of a friend who was in the group. And so she made sure my application got to the hiring manager so that it didn't just get stuck in HR, because at some companies, if you don't like meet certain criteria quite clearly, you could be just completely screened out and never looked at. So definitely anytime you can find a way to network in, like with LinkedIn, and get somebody inside to hand your application to a hiring manager, that's very useful. I think that was everything. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Cynthia. Thank you.
Great.
We have like at least 4 more questions, but the one I think is you already talk about the how necessary is a postdoc. Well, Kristen said, thanks for the presentation. Do you have any specific suggestion for who to get a position in bioinformatics? Are there any skills that are particularly useful landing a bioinformatics role?
Bioinformatics. So I've never done bioinformatics, so it makes it a little hard to answer that. But here's what I would say. I think it's good to try and network with somebody in a company who is doing bioinformatics and ask them these questions to help you with that. So I mentioned, you know, that I joined AMWA, the American Medical Writers Association, when I was looking to be a medical writer. And the way I even found out such a thing existed was because I had reached out to people who were medical writers and asked them what they would recommend as to get ready and make this change. And that was one of the things they recommended. So I think whether bioinformatics or any other specific type of role, I would very much encourage you to reach out to people via LinkedIn, ask them if they'd be willing to talk for 15, 20 minutes with you as an informational interview to learn more about what they're doing. You won't always get responses from those kind of messages, but often you will, because a lot of us, you know, we all had to make the transition. We remember it was hard. We remember we were asking people to tell us how to do it. And so a lot of people are very open to having those types of discussions. Just make sure you're always very, you know, when you do have those kind of conversations, that you come in with clear questions and that you're like very respectful about their time. You make sure you end on time and they can go to their next meeting, what have you.
Great. The next question, Cynthia, is from Olga. Hi, Cynthia. Thank you for taking time to share your journey with us. What were your favorite and least favorite parts from each of your roles?
Sure. Yeah. All right, so here, I can back up to my roles. So the medical writing, as I said, medical writers are responsible for writing all of the documents that we submit to the FDA. And so the best part about that for me was like being so deeply involved in the science of what we were doing and how we communicated it. I did debate in high school, and so this felt very much in line with kind of that debate training. I love thinking about how to put the argument together. Especially, I was involved in one submission to the FDA for a new drug application where the study had failed the primary endpoint, but we had a lot of information that really led us to believe the drug worked. And it was such an exciting time to be getting questions from the FDA, putting together the arguments and sending them back about why we believed the drug worked, and it was ultimately approved. The hard part about that job is that at many companies always want you to go faster. And so if you're the one writing up the data at the end of this long timeline, and you're the last one before you hit the milestone, you submitted the documents, your timeline is always getting crunched tighter and tighter. And many people in the company are very interested in what you are saying. So you are getting a lot of feedback. Sometimes people are happy and sometimes they're not. And you have to, be on the receiving end of all of that and triaging it and making sure everything still moves forward very rapidly. As a clinical scientist, I really loved that I was helping actually design the study in detail. As a medical writer, I was part of those discussions, but as a clinical scientist, I was really in there designing the study with the biostatistician and with the medical director. So I loved doing that. The things I didn't like so much about being a clinical scientist were this particular role at Vertex had some limitations in what activities I could be involved in. And those were ones that which are really what I do full time now, which are really, managing across the portfolio and thinking about how, kind of this wider lens thinking about how we move forward. And so that's the best part of my job now. And what's the worst part of my job now? Oh no, I love my job right now. I suppose the worst part is that I might spend a lot of time negotiating a timeline with all the functions, and then it just needs to be shortened. And so you're like, why did I spend all that time negotiating with everybody? But yeah.
Thank you. The next, next question is from Lanshen. Hi, Cynthia, thanks for sharing your experience with us. I'm very interested in clinical studies, but when I look at the job market, there are so many different roles, such as clinical research associate, clinical scientists, and a lot of them don't look for PhDs, and they require some certificates. May I know how we should prepare for and look for those jobs?
Yeah, so definitely one of the challenges is interpreting all of the jobs that are listed. Some of it was just, I remember being just gobbledygook to me when I was looking for roles. I have no idea what this means. So I think there are a few pieces to this. And the first is figuring out what the jobs actually are, right? And again, I think networking is your best way to figure that out. If you can find someone who has a similar role, or you can find someone at that company, because exactly what the job responsibilities are for a role can also vary from company to company. Like the clinical scientist at Vertex is not exactly the same role as the clinical scientist at Pfizer or at a small biotech company. So networking is a good way to figure out exactly what they're looking for. Now, a lot of the roles that are in clinical development don't specify that they're looking for PhDs, but that doesn't mean they don't think that's a big plus, right? It's just that they don't think that's the candidate pool that they're drawing from, or they don't think a PhD is required for someone to be successful in that job. But that said, I think people always find that somebody who has a PhD training, like that's a big plus to them. And as far as the certificates, exactly what type of certificate they're looking for, it could be flexible or not, and it depends on the role. So if you can, again, if you can network in and find out how important it is, that's beneficial. Some things are easy to get, and some things are the equivalent of a master's degree. If it's something easy to get and you know you're like headed in that direction, it might benefit you to just go ahead and do the certificate. But it depends if you're really, you know, dedicated to that path.
I was muted. Kelly, thanks for being here. Can you please comment on the flexibility and work-life balancing in industry? I think academics stress that these are very poor in industry as a way to elevate academic jobs.
Well, I don't know. That may be true. It is fun, you know, it is funny. I remember when I moved from academics to industry, some of the professors I worked with looked at me like I had just died. Like they couldn't believe I would do such a thing to myself. I think work-life balance in any situation, you know, can vary by the company you're at and then the boundaries that you put in place. And so companies all have different cultures. And that's something, again, you want to learn about when you're applying to a company. And if it's not something you learn about before an interview, it's something you can ask about during an interview. I wouldn't, during an interview, you know, I'd be careful about how you talk about work-life balance, because even though it's something we all value and all think is important, if it sounds like that's the only thing you're worried about, it can spook people. But I think it's important to ask about the culture. Do people take their vacations? Yeah, things like that. You can come up with questions that are specific that don't spook people. But I would say, so a lot of it, I think, does come down to boundaries that you set. And I think that's true in academics and in industry, because I knew a lot of people in academics who were working all the time. And it was, for me, it was actually when I had my kids that I really learned to set those boundaries, because for them, they are like my priority and I have to take care of that. It's just, I think, about how you communicate things, how you set the boundaries. Most companies are not going to set the boundaries for you. You have to do that. And you have, and you can manage that with your manager by talking about what your workload is like, whether you can take on more projects or not. And you can keep the conversation very much about the work and like what you're, you know, where you are, whether you're starting to burn out and you need to offload something, we need to bring additional resources onto this program.
We have another question for Christoph. Out of curiosity, if you are interested in pursuing diagnostic drug development and a specific indication, a higher indication, is it worth again any industry experience, or is it worth being chosen in selecting roles, companies involved in that indication?
Yeah, you know, that I think that is about your own personal priorities, really. How, you know, what do you value the most? If you have, you know, diagnostics and anything that involves devices is kind of a niche in biotech industry. And so if you have a background that lends you towards that, like, I think just go for it, you know. But I think all these things, you know, are trade-offs, and you have to think about your own priorities. Is it more important to you to get the job right now, or to find, you know, that niche indication job you're looking for? If you have, you know, for instance, Vertex has like a diabetes program. And so people who have a strong background in diabetes, you know, that does bring you to the top of like the list when they're looking for candidates. So if you have a background that predisposes you in a certain direction, that can be very valued by companies.
Question from Arun. Nowadays, not many industries willing to sponsor visa, even though I am qualified for the role. How to overcome that?
That is a real issue. I totally recognize that. I had someone who was working for me who needed his green card sponsored, and it was a journey to get that done. You know, within each company, they're going to have their rules and thoughts about why they have these limits. And so without knowing what the rationale is within the company, it can be pretty hard to argue you know, with them about it. I would just say, you know, try to get your best foot forward and show how strong you are as a candidate. But in the end, you know, you're going to kind of be stuck with whatever their internal policies are around that. But places, you know, if you are the right candidate and they are still looking for someone, you know, they can be flexible about these things. Companies can be flexible about a lot, you know, a lot of things when you're the right candidate and they need somebody.
More question. I think we have like time. We have time for one more question, Cynthia.
Yep.
Let's see if someone audience.
There was somebody who said they had one more for the end.
Oh yes.
I can ask a question. So my question is, since you said you are currently in a role of project manager, and in one of our courses we were introduced to project management and PMP certificate. So do you think if I do that certificate, so I will be able to get a job as a project manager, or do they still prefer candidates having those experience in PhD and postdoc to have those positions?
I would say if you're interested in moving into program management, getting a certificate like that can only help you, right?
Okay.
It can only help you. It demonstrates your commitment to that path, you know, and that you've gone about getting the skill set. What I would, you know, when you're looking at roles, so project management can come in a number of flavors. And so roles where it's very specific to one function at the company. Say it's the project manager for the manufacturing group. It's the project manager for the toxicology group. Those kind of roles are easier to make the step into industry than something like what I'm doing now, because of the nature of the role I'm in, where it's really like spanning functions, and they're going to really look for someone who's already been in industry, you know, who knows how it works, basically, how the game works. But those functional roles, the project manager roles, can be much easier to make a step into industry with.
All right, thank you.
Well, one more question? Or,
yeah, I think I can get that last one real quick.
Okay.
I think if you can get an industry postdoc, that puts you a step ahead over an academic postdoc when people are hiring for full-time staff later. Because an industry postdoc, if you've done that, it removes that question mark about, do you really understand what industry is? And, you know, do you really want to be in industry? Because that question's answered, right? but I think, it isn't necessary to do a postdoc, but if you're sitting here and you're at the end of your program, you're trying to decide what postdoc to apply for and you're interested in industry, I would definitely encourage you to apply for industry postdocs, because that, like I said, eliminates the question of whether you're really interested in industry.
Cynthia, thank you very much. Edward asked like if you can reach you through email, or can you share your email?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes, happy to talk.
And like, I just want to thank you. It was great. A lot of questions, like a huge audience. Thank you very much for your time and for sharing your experience with us.
Thanks, I enjoyed it. Bye.
Bye, people.